So good morning. My name is Felipe Martinez. I'm a professor here at the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion that will explore the implications for measurement and psychometrics of the ideas that we just heard advanced and discussed in the plenary session before us. Welcome all. We're really excited and happy to have you in campus. I want to introduce the panelists again. I'll do a full introduction because these panels will eventually leave as separate videos that we hope to upload and to share with people. And so I want to introduce our distinguished panelists that join us today to discuss these topics. Randy Bennett, the Norman O. Fredrickson Chair in Assessment Innovation at the Educational Testing Service. Guillermo Solano-Flores, a professor of education at Stanford University. And he won't like me for saying this, but last night he was appointed by Secretary Cardona to the National Assessment Governing Board. I figured it would be a relevant qualification for this panel. It's the board that, we're not going to ask him to now govern over assessment in the U.S. He's not going to be able to do that, but it's the panel that oversees the Nation's Report Card, the NAEP test that we've all heard about. And that it is actually, in my opinion, in all this discussion about assessment, is this very bright example of a test that has a lot more goods than bads and that we keep forgetting about exists and can, I think, lead the way in some important ways for us. So congratulations, Willy, well deserved. Give him hell. Go for broke. Tong, Senior Vice President for Assessment Operations at NBME, National Board of Medical Examiners, and former President of NCME, immediate past President of NCME, which is, of course, one of the sponsoring organizations of the standards. And finally, last but, as you know full well, not least, Lee Tsai, professor here at UCLA, director of CREST, and one of the world's leading psychometricians this day. And also an incredibly clear thinker and someone I deeply enjoy talking with and exchanging ideas with. With this panel, you're in for a treat. We're going to again discuss the implications of the ideas about fairness advanced in the plenary and in the special issue of the journal for measurement psychometrics more specifically. So don't worry, the panelists promise to not throw a lot of equations at you. We're not going to be doing that type of discussion. We're going to be thinking about implications for some of the technical matters and technical adjacent matters. The way we want to do this is that I prepared a few questions or more framing topics that then I'll ask the panelists to discuss and to give some take on. And then things after that can proceed in a fairly conversational manner. You're free to respond to each other, engage in conversation. And if it feels like we've exhausted one of the topics, I'll jump us to the next. I'll help us move us to the next, and hopefully it'll flow that way. Trying to save some time at the end for this time engaging in more extensive questions from the audience. And so if that's okay with all, let's get started. Sorry.
Oh yeah, it's good. Very.
Need to hold it like a punk rocker. Right? All right. Where are my notes? All right, so let's start with an easy one. So we heard powerful words and a powerful overview of in the plenary about the long history of bias, and then not in some conceptual way, but outright harm that has been associated at the level of individuals and at a systemic level that's been associated with testing historically. Now, some of the ideas advanced by critics of standardized testing outside of this room sometimes sound, I don't think it would be the case in that room or in this room, but sometimes sound like they question the very notion that we can put kids from different cultural backgrounds in an equivalent scale of, say, math or reading or whatever topic we're talking about. So Randy said some ideas about sufficiently equivalent, and I wanted to jump on that to have us explore those ideas. How do you come to understand this rather fundamental assumption of testing and the challenges we face in it, and specifically are the challenges technical, conceptual, ethical, political, or what type? And so I'll pass, since I'm close here, I'll pass it to Lee, and then maybe we can go in that direction. I'll tell you when we're starting to go too long in this question, and then we can move on to the next.
So do you intend me to start and then we can?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, pleasure to be here. I hope you can hear me. By the way, as I look from here, this is an incredibly diverse crowd. I know many of you coming from different backgrounds, and just the look of it, this is signaling something that's quite significant. So on that question, which is by no means easy at all, I do have some additional historical perceptions that earlier over in the main session that I hope everyone enjoyed that I was going to make. And the main historical lesson here is that, in fact, if we look past several centuries, including in other places, such as in China, where I happen to grow up, and having taken many assessments, that there is a history of similar issues popping up that probably needs to be told, and the lessons learned there could shed some light on the general situation that we have here. So 2 stories. One is that roughly in the 9th century, in the Song dynasty, the situation was that the capital city in present-day Henan province is most prosperous, over 1 million people anywhere in the world at that time. There was no such megatropolis. Highly prosperous, lots of concentration of education resources. So as a result, as you know, that the standardized tests were invented by the Sui dynasty emperor some, several hundred years earlier. What it turned out was that all of the entrants or admitted or qualified candidates came from the neighboring provinces of the capital. So it got so bad that one of the leading scholars at the time, the prime minister, that every Chinese school children remembers his name because of naughty things that he did as a kid, Sima Guang, he suggested that we should basically devise a percentage plan. We keep the exam papers fixed, but we devise a percentage plan and allow the more remote provinces, regions, to have a better opportunity to send their children to serve in the central bureaucracy and therefore advance their own interests and hopefully lead to better development and better potential. That also, of course, addresses this very apparent lack of equal distribution of a coveted resource. It was a big debate, and the opposing side, very well-known poet, who I could still recite his poems, Ouyang Xiu, he suggested that no, that is against the basic procedures of apparent fairness, because everybody was at the time tested on this one paper, testing Confucian philosophy and poetry, and it was sealed. Nobody knew who the examinees were. In fact, you couldn't even tell the handwriting because it was transcribed by a centralized service that the readers don't know who the original entrants or examinees were. There was a big debate. It was left alone. Nobody wanted to touch that. So the system kind of just mumbled along for centuries until in the Ming Dynasty, it sort of reared its ugly head again. This was about 600 years ago. The first Ming emperor, known for his ruthlessness, he, in the 30th year of his reign, he organizes Imperial Civil Service exam. And then it turns out that every single qualified candidate came from the southern part of China. And it was because the north at that time had been ravaged by warfare and famine, resulting from earlier, largely Mongolian invasion centuries ago. So there was not a basic development of educational infrastructure. Whereas in the south, everything was going as normal, and there was schools, there was, candidates. So they were sent to these civil service exams. What the emperor eventually decided was that, well, it's a bad idea to not have any representation from the north, so I'm going to have two papers. One set of exam papers for the north, another set of exam papers for the southern part of China. And that persisted throughout the end until the very last days of the Imperial Civil Service exam system in mainland China. So one of the things that I think that it might be worthwhile to point out is that all assessment systems must periodically look at itself and then look at how far it has grown from the original roots. We know that certain standardized assessments, such as the SAT, was initially intended to address disparities in access. But as we also know, and I quote, in this June 2018 Atlantic article by Matthew Stewart, he said, the 9.9% is the new American aristocracy, and the meritocrat class has mastered the old trick of consolidating wealth and passing privilege along at the expense of other people's children. And another very important insight is that sometimes basic procedural fairness doesn't always generate, in aggregate, the desired outcome. It is one of the delusions of our meritocratic class, however, to assume that if our own actions are individually blameless, then the sum of our actions will be good for society. And this refers, of course, to the very large group differences that we can observe. These group differences become a big problem if such assessments are used to allocate scarce and highly coveted resources because of, all kinds of bad things that could happen, other than, of course, legally speaking, disparate impact. So one of the other things that I wanted to mention here is that you could, in fact, from a psychometric standpoint, remove these differences by explicit conditioning, either conditioning in the very hated adversity score adjusted SAT, which was alive for 2 weeks before the College Board had to pull it away, or the much-loved environmental context statute, also provided by the College Board, exactly the same information but used in a judgmental and qualitative way by the admissions staff at major research universities, selective institutions like this one, in the admissions process. It's a form of conditioning. It's a form of acknowledging that everybody comes from different backgrounds, and including University of California's percent plan, which is the top 9%, also called the eligibility in local context rule. And finally, there is another way of conditioning, which is what Ms. Levy referred to and referenced in many papers here, that is conditioning in the sense that you provide for different kinds of experiences based on what we know of the student's background. But there are also other ways of getting close to that without necessarily introducing politically and legally dubious fights, and that would be looking at, for example, growth, looking at how far a student has come in terms of achievement, instead of looking at a snapshot of the achievement. For example, there could be examinations of the different kinds of assessments that can be designed with say, educational technology that really gets closer to where instruction is happening, and that's where tech could play a very productive and dedicated role. And finally, last but sort of not the least, is that these things must happen periodically. It just needs to happen every decade or so, that we have to come to terms with whether we're doing enough. I think that the last round of criticism against the standardized tests, psychometricians have responded to in a way that, well, every item has been screened for diff, it's gone through bias reviews, therefore we're all good. You run the risk over time for getting that whole system, to live in the ethosphere that's detached from the reality, and the reality is there. It will eventually come back to bite you.
We're gonna try to. Okay. One of the achievements for today is we are not gonna try to strangle each other using these ropes. So this is a great question. I felt like it's fundamentally, like, as a psychometricians, we're asking, can we compare people on the common metric? And as a psychometrician who is very vested to continue my career as a psychometrician, my answer obviously has to be yes. We have to be. But I think a couple of different points in there is, yes, we can, and a test score is not going to be, a single number is not going to be able to describe who I am as an individual, what I can do as a professional, right? It needs to be one piece of information. It's not going to be entirety, right? I remember this song called Feel Like a Number. We are not just a number. Hopefully it's a portfolio approach of different things. So that was my first point. Is this a technical, conceptual, ethical? Definitely not technical. I don't believe there's a magical model there that would be able to solve all these challenges. It's a very social construct. Race is a social construct. Fairness is a social construct. What we're trying to do here is also a social construct. But at the same time, I think psychometrics can provide tools as one piece of information to differentiate. I know my other thing is, on the other hand, should we still have assessments, high-stakes assessments? Well, I have children. I would like my children to be taught by licensed teachers. When I have an illness, I need to go see a doctor. I would like to be seen by a licensed doctor who's going to operate me, better have very good surgical experiences and learning, right? So there are places for high-stakes assessments. But at the same time, I think what continue to push right now is around how can we use assessments both to evaluate, but also, most importantly, as a learning tool to really help people to be able to live to their full potential. So briefly, yes, we can, and we need to do better. Thank you.
This is essentially a common metric and fairness. If there were more fairness and we were living in a more equitable world and society, probably the tests would not be so focused on one score and one scale along which you classify students. It would be more like a matrix telling us, the results of tests would be more like metrics telling us relationships between unidimensional measures of multiple variables at the student level, so that we could make a precise, informed decisions, instructional decisions, for example. I don't know the details of the history, but I would assume that somehow a common metrics and the obsession for scaling and ranking is a reflection of the need to perpetuate power. So if you have measures that of different students on the same scale, you want to have control of that if you are privileged. So I think that all this discussion that we're having about fairness and the psychometric implications are related to the fact as well that we have to recognize that the field of measurement educational measurement and psychometrics is in crisis conceptually. We are beginning to recognize that some things don't work the way in which they are supposed to be working. We have now artificial intelligence, for example, that in principle can help to develop tests and maybe reducing costs, but at the same time, there's a lot of challenges and questions about fairness and so on. When I say that the field is in crisis, I'm saying this with optimism, because this is a good opportunity for us to rethink the practices and to develop new conceptualizations of measurement. So can we have going back to your question, Felipe, I don't think that we have the answers, and the fact that we don't have the answers, or we have ideals that we don't know how to get there, is because this is a time in which we need to rethink psychometrics as a field.
I think we can put examinees on a common scale because we already do. And we already do it across many different types of variation. We do it in operational testing programs. We do it across variations associated with exceptionality, native language, interests, identity, and test location, among other things. And the solutions that we arrive at in different cases are sometimes technical, sometimes conceptual, and sometimes ethical. So, for example, in international assessments like PISA, TIMSS, PEARLS, the solutions are more technically oriented than otherwise. In programs like advanced placement, art and design, research and seminar, the solutions are much more conceptually oriented. That is, they're driven by creating common rubrics that are used to place examinees on the same scale who have essentially created their own tests and submitted evidence that is then made comparable through these common rubrics. With respect to examinees who need accommodations because they have some exceptionality, the solution is more of an ethically based one. That is, we've determined it's the right thing to do to call scores that come from a Braille assessment the same or comparable to scores that come from a large type assessment, to scores that come from an assessment delivered auditorily, to scores that come from an assessment delivered in the standard form. We've declared by fiat that those are comparable. So as I say, I think we can do it because we do it. And if we say we can't do it, then we have to figure out why we can't do it in this case, but we do it in all those other cases.
Well, okay, well, I'll tell you, we would start with an easy one, right? So one big idea that's advancing the special issue, and that was already explored in the plenary before, is that by minimizing construct-irrelevant variance and trying to make items and tests, quote-unquote, culture-free, they end up being these largely bland prototypes of the dominant culture. They're not culture-free, they just sort of focus on one particular culture, and in this case, it's obvious that ended up being pretty explicitly middle-class, white-centric. Now, it's fair to say, I was reminded of an item in one of Jim Popham's old textbooks in educational measurement, an item where little Peter, young Peter, goes sailing with his dad, sporting a cardigan sweater. This This was an item, right? It was a math item because then that was used to do some operation on the speed of the wind or something, right? And so it's fair to say that those items are now rare. And it's fair to call that progress. We can find those most egregious types of examples that we used to find in tests. It's actually important that we don't pretend like those still exist, because they actually make it sound like it would be very easy to fix the things that we still need to fix. Those are not there anymore for the most part, at least in most tests. But we still have this problem with tests end up being disproportionately oriented towards a certain type of background in student life experience. And so the special issue authors, Randy and Jennifer, take two approaches in addressing these concerns about construct relevant variance. Randy explores the idea of customizing items more, and he was already talking about it before here, different options for doing that. And Jennifer, on the other hand, suggests diversifying the content of the items themselves so that they actually reflect students and people of different backgrounds, different topics, different themes, not sterilizing the content. So I want to ask you to explore more on these ideas, these avenues, whether you see them as mutually exclusive or not. I'm going to guess that they're not. They need not be, but they also reflect different types of priorities and assumptions. And so it seems like it's worth exploring in some more detail. And in this case, let's start in the reverse order with you, Randy, since you actually very explicitly talked about it.
Okay. So I think a very useful insight was Bob Mislevy's idea that the goal of assessment ought to be maximizing construct relevant variance or minimizing construct irrelevant variance for you, meaning for the individual, as opposed to maximizing or minimizing on average, which is what we do today. We strive to maximize construct relevant variance or minimize irrelevant variance on average. And by doing it on average, we're disadvantaging some individuals and probably some groups. So the trick is, what's the best way to maximize for the individual? And I think that line of thinking leads one down a path of personalization. And how we go about personalization is certainly an issue. Do we allow examinees to personalize? Do we personalize for them? Is at the heart of that issue. If we personalize for them, then we run the risk of stereotyping. We run the risk of making decisions for examinees that they may then feel were not in their best interests. On the other hand, if we allow them to personalize the assessment, then they are making those decisions, but they may not necessarily make the decisions that best benefit them. And we're making choice part of the construct. And you can argue whether or not that's a good idea or a bad idea. On the one hand, you as a professor, me as a scientist, those of you who are graduate students are making choices every day about what it is you need to do and should be doing in order to advance your learning or in order to advance your scholarship. That's part of the construct at the level of higher education for sure. But maybe we ought to be helping students learn to make good choices in the context of middle school and high school and maybe even elementary school. So from that point of view, making choice part of a construct may have some sense to it.
Thank you, Randy. Can you move your... As you can see, there's a lot of confusion in the field of psychometrics. It's a mess, right? So I'm gonna try to answer the question from the perspective of assessment development. And this is related to what I was saying earlier today, that it's not about the instrument itself, but also the whole system, how the idea of an assessment comes out, how it's formalized in an assessment framework, for example, how tests are administered, and so on. But in the case of assessment development, I have to say that there are many people are committed are concerned, not necessarily committed, but concerned about fairness. But as with many ideals and principles, when you ask them to change their practices, the way things do, the way they do things, it is very difficult to promote change. And a very simple example, and you heard me the other day share this example. Some years ago, I developed a framework on accessibility. And essentially, I proposed that, amongst many other things, that one thing that you could do very simple when you are writing all those tests with stories and characters and those items with contextual information with the stories and characters, you see that the test developers use many names, and they try to be culturally sensitive and reflect the different cultures in the names of the characters. And sometimes they end up with names that may be very complicated or very unfamiliar to certain groups. So what I said is, why not choose, put together a panel of people, from different, we can talk about the specialties or whatever later, but essentially come up with 20 names that you are going to be using consistently from first grade to high school, all the time, that you have properly represented gender, assumed ethnicity or nationality or a background and so on, and names that are simple: Juan, Yukari, Min, that everybody will know that when they see the word Min or Yukari, they are referring to a girl or a boy or something. You respect diversity, you honor diversity, but you do not push it to the end of which people have a hard time understanding. Obviously, this sounds simple in principle, but actually make sure, for example, that those names don't have other meanings in other languages, right? And I can tell you horror stories about that. But so if you have a panel of people with the appropriate specialties and professional practice, you will come up with something that will be used consistently. You don't have to worry about that. And also, there's another thing. Keep a tally. You know that in many of those items with characters, there's someone who is wrong and something who is right, and you have to decide who's wrong and who's right, like in those mathematics problems. Well, keep a tally. This time Yukari, who is a female, was wrong. Next time it's gonna be she's gonna be right, and so on. So it's simple in principle. Nobody does it, and essentially it's because people have their way of doing things, and it's something that we need to fight. The inertia. And so I don't know if I responded something about your question, but I wanted to share it.
I'm going to try to address the question. I have 2 points I want to make. One was, and I was actually talking to Randy a little bit about this earlier. The notion of personalizing assessments for people based on their own culture, value, etc., whether it's their own choice or whether we choose it for them. I actually don't like the idea. I told Randy that too, because I think, and I will go back to my earlier point at the plenary session, assessments do drive instruction, whether we like it or not. And so I think if we personalize assessments for people, we lose an incredible opportunity to have people, have children, have adults go through and understand other culture as well. We don't live in a box. We need to appreciate other people, other culture, other value. And we need to have some type of understanding. And if we go through assessments using a variety of different culture backgrounds, etc., I actually think that's an incredible teaching opportunity for children, for kids, for adults as well. So that's one point. The justice-oriented approach is where I think we should really think about. Just don't do the one culture, the average, but make it a variety. So that's one point. The other thing that I'll give people in a very concrete example. So I work in medical licensing exams now. NBME, the National Board of Medical Examiners, where I am, we do the United States Medical Licensing Examination, the USMLE series. So if you want to be a physician in the US, you have to pass our exams to be a licensed physician. So that's a very high stake assessment. So one very interesting debate in our type of items is, should we include patient characteristics in our test items, in our vignettes, in our how we describe? So do we say someone come in, do we talk about the person's gender, age, ethnicity, etc.? Right? There are a school of thoughts where people would argue it has nothing to do with the diagnosis. When it has nothing to do with the diagnosis, we should not mention that. But if you don't really talk about patients as people, these potential future doctors, who do they see? Who are they going to think in their minds? And they are the people who are going to see a lot of patients coming from a lot of backgrounds, right? So how can we, using that as an opportunity to teach people, to really let them see the world is diverse out there, and we better get ready to be able to address it. One of the things that we're actually in the process of getting some work done, and I would be very curious to hear any recommendations from you all when we have our conversations later, is one of the things I'm trying to do for as a project for our next year to really influence our item development process is this idea that Jennifer Randall was talking about, the justice-oriented. But what I want to do is, we all know we have personal bias and stereotypes around particular age, gender, ethnicity, what have you, right? And then how that would really influence people, future physicians, in their diagnosis. So we want to conscientiously build in some content in our test items to talk about anti-bias, anti-stereotyping, like really attack some of those stereotyping concepts and build that into the assessment. Is that really related to the construct we're measuring? Maybe not directly, but again, we can't live in the box. We have to be able to open. So, thanks.
Thank you very much. I really, really love, especially the discussions around personalization. I think that one of Randy's earlier points about the psychometric profession, and I am a statistician who happen over time to be interested in all of these topics, is the notion that there is some sort of a curve, largely symmetrical, probably bell-shaped, and then the middle part of it is where most of the emphasis is located. And then we try to minimize the error variance so that we declare that there is very high reliability, and you check off the first chapter of the technical manual or standards, second chapter. And then the other thing that the personalization brought was that and for fear of throwing equations at you, but I'm going to use the geometry of this room to describe it. really what the psychometricians have been focusing on is very one-dimensional. So let's say it's just this wall against us. There is a y, which would be some type of a probability of observing a behavior, an action, something you can look up, touch, and feel. Could be a response on a multiple choice exam. There's a probability associated with that. Now, all that we cared about was along this one dimension, what is the probability of someone with lower proficiency versus someone with higher proficiency in, say, math would get this thing right or wrong. That's all that we have cared about in the backdrop of a population distribution, as I said, largely normal. Now, the problem, of course, is that this room is not just two-dimensional. The room is three-dimensional. At the minimum, there is this other wall that's along here that's, let's call it Z. That's something having to do with the infinite variety of backgrounds that what you bring already into the assessment process, even before that you step into this room. And personalization aims to bring that information along with what we think might be related, which is this line that where I'm at of, say, math proficiency. Why we care about math proficiency? Well, perhaps because it's of some important consequential use, because of the way that the assessment might be used to make some decisions, because it might be related to something else that we observe that might be important. Whatever, that's a socially constructed idea. So we assess that. Let's call this thing X. So you have Y and Z and X. And so far, the psychometricians have cared only about the relationship between Y and X. So personalization or conditioning, explicit conditioning, cares about where you are along Z. Now, I would also, at this point, then caution the extreme versions of personalization. And as someone who's developed software and knows software engineering, we always try to push things into the extremes. So if you really truly personalized for every little bit of a variation, infinitesimal difference along Z, there's also infinitesimally different, let's say, yes, math proficiency might be quite a bit higher than mine, but let's say we're just a little bit different. Now, when you think about it, if you personalize and altered the probability, the conditional probability of observing Y based on slightly different values of X and Z, what you're actually going to observe is just along this diagonal. All of the information will be concentrated along this diagonal. So might not be a great idea, because you could argue, since Z and X are symmetric, you could argue that what you in fact have measured is not X, but in fact you've measured Z, if you push it to that extreme end of personalization. And hence out the door goes exchangeability, comparability, all of these ideas. But there's a more moderate form of exchangeability or comparability, which is for a sufficiently narrowly defined neighborhood, could be chosen by a panel, could be chosen by students, could be chosen by experts. Although I would also always warn against expert-chosen, unelected experts-chosen things, because that may not be the most rational decision. We're all human beings. We have our own individual idiosyncrasies. But let's say if you choose that, there's a caliper, there's a small region where you could personalize, and then you could actually observe for different people with similar values of Z, they might have different values of X. You could actually devise a scaling method that would provide for comparable measures of X within that region. So instead of observing everything along this main diagonal, you actually observe a cloud of points along the way, covering both different, and I'm simplifying, different values of Z and different values of X. And that potentially is something that we should consider. But I would still like to argue that, those very too crude historical blunt policy instruments that the Chinese systems have used, one is to basically have explicit conditioning by creating some sort of a percentage plan or recognizing that there is a background variable called where you're born. Let's take that into account. There's another way of doing it, which is to basically create different kinds of exam questions for different populations. At the end of the day, over several centuries, with no change, they completely failed at the initial ask, which is to address apparent inequities in the outcomes. So this has to be something that is constantly, periodically asked of our assessment systems. And finally, the point could be that, in certain areas of educational psychology, probably say in gifted ed, when people look at how you define giftedness, a lot of the tests that were used were actually concentrated on the more verbal and quantitative aspects of giftedness. There's the spatial and visual dimension that will be very difficult to assess. That's ignored. And we know that there's huge amount of additional variation that's there. In college admissions, we all concentrate on the ACTs and SATs and high school GPAs, extracurriculars, and so on and so forth. But there are other things that might define college readiness or success in college, largely classified as the non-cognitive variables of interest that have not been developed sufficiently for use in broad-based settings. And finally, I think that the interest has been largely focused on, very misguided, but largely focused on, say, how, for example, the prototypical standardized test is the SAT. Well, it's been used for many years by selective institutions, private and certain elite public ones, like this. Let's forget about all these institutions. They're never going to change their assessment practice. What they do has zero implication for the vast majority of students who will enter higher ed or into the workforce. It's that middle layer, that 80% and below. That's where things get a lot more interesting, and you could potentially use other kinds of measures. You could think about other ways of using educational technology to help bring these other constructs into the fold that are far less related to, disparities that we already see in society.
Could I say just just 1 minute? The Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium has been using accessibility resources, and then students may be able to activate pop-up illustrations or definitions or audio at the word level, for example, when they are taking a test. Well, the important thing about this kind of support is that the student uses those supports depending on their own needs. So that means that in principle, each student has its own set of needs, and they are going to use those resources that are available for them to use if they need them. Essentially, what this approach is doing is recognizing that there's a lot of heterogeneity among students, but also using a probabilistic perspective. We don't know who is going to need what, but we make it accessible for those who need it. So critical to making customization work is recognizing our uncertainty, our ignorance about the characteristics of each individual, no matter what labels and categories and measures we have about them, and then acting and designing devices that with a probabilistic perspective that is resilient to that kind of uncertainty.
Thank you, Willy. So I want to be mindful of time, and I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time at the end for questions. And so I'm going to do something that's perhaps ill-advised for a moderator to do, which is I'm going to ask 2 questions at once. And then let you, and I think that they're sufficiently related that I think it makes sense so that we address them both in some way. And you decide how do you want to address them, and which one you want to focus on. The first one is zooming into some of the topics and the issues that you were already raising that gets us into more technical matter. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about sort of where's the science on the psychometric and the measurement science on some of these questions, and what new models or developments or adaptations or advances are needed if we're going to make progress in the direction of this fairer world, or very standardized testing world. There's a lot of grad students in the room, and so if you have dissertation titles, dissertation topics, I'm sure there'll be. I mean, there's a student Q&A session later, but if you have some ideas, you can start thinking about those and maybe helping us think about where we need to lead our students to do the work. The second question, which again I'm going to just sneakily try to tie to this first one, so that we get to it in some ways. We keep talking about large-scale assessment because it's very prominent and visible, and because it tends to have high stakes, like Lee was saying, where I agree with him, disproportionately focused on who gets into these super elite institutions, to the detriment of what I think are, I agree with Lee, in fact, more important equity issues. That's a little bit of a side note, but some would argue that assessment that happens in the classrooms, year-round assessment, progress assessment, interim assessment, you name it, whatever you call it, is as influential, impactful, if not more, in student trajectories and eventual outcomes. And so I also wanted to ask you, where's the science on that, and what type of because that in my mind and in my world, I was never enough of an advanced psychometrician to get into that world. That takes us into a real frontier of psychometrics that again starts to talk about personalization, etc. And so again, apologies for asking two very complex questions at once, but hopefully they're close enough that we can handle in some ways. And then after that, I will open it for questions from the audience. And in the interest of keeping this randomizing, I'm going to ask Yai to go first.
I'll be brief, and I'll try to address both. So the first one is around, is there a magical bullet out there, basically, that can solve all of our challenges? And I don't think so. It's a cultural construct. It's a social construct. It's really not pure scientific, if you will. It's a combination of science and arts. The way I like to think about it is, the analogy I'll do is, like, we have diff analysis to try to see if an item is biased. You can calculate the diff statistic, but it doesn't really guarantee, right, the item is biased. It just basically gives us a tool to take an extra look at things. And so I think there are opportunities with new models, new development, but it's not going to be the perfect solution. It's going to be an extra tool that help shed more lights into the potential things that we can look into. So that's my response to the first question. Classroom is where learning really occurs. Classroom is where every single student gets recognized, validated, and celebrated. And that's where the opportunities really are. We see this shift for using assessment, not just of learning, where you are at a given point in time, but for learning. Whether we want to call it formative assessments, we want to call it diagnostic assessments, what have you, but I really see that as a potential for measurement professionals to continue to really push, to think about what it means to have assessments for learning. What does it mean in our classroom in the K-12? What does it mean for our higher ed? What does it mean for graduate students at a measurement program? For my job related, what does it mean to successfully train future doctors? It's not just going to be knowledge. It's not going to be enough. There will be skills demand. There will be behavior demand. So what are some of the things that we can use assessments to truly really help learners and truly think about? It's not going to be one number that's going to determine my future, but it's more of a portfolio approach where I can see where my strengths are, where my weaknesses are, what I can do to continue. So for classroom assessments, this is where we could really incorporate some of the fairness issues we're talking about. We could really enlighten our learners to embrace this world of diversity, but also think about how we want to approach it as individuals. Thank you.
So I'm going to try to address the technical questions regarding where the science is at with regards to both the 3-year, the in-classroom, the longitudinal piece, as well as personalization. So there are definitely there have been models and tremendous development in terms of how we do data analysis over the last 15 years, and especially the last couple. As Miss Levy, long time ago, explicitly mentioned, this was before he wrote his recent book, this is way back when he was a graduate student working with Darrell Bach, that the conditioning, this is all, at the end of the day, you could condition in any way you want. You have to be prepared to justify how you condition. The models are out there, how you measure the variables that you condition on, and how you choose to bring the conditioning variables into your measurement process. That has to be embedded in assessment design. Now, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, and all of the other international assessments that's now done in its image, that's an example of how you use large-scale databases and background variables to condition to get at the kinds of inferences that you want, which is to study at a large scale what the output of the system is like and where disparities are and how they compare longitudinally. And then the other piece is the longitudinal or growth aspect. This has to do with understanding that it's not just one variable. It's not just one axis of x, but many x's. In fact, you could, if you're a physicist, you could think of x as it's a collapsed dimension. It's representing many other dimensions that's out there that could be used for understanding individual differences, wherever they come from, or how much they learn, how fast they've approached things. And that runs up against the existing infrastructure immediately. Now, at CREST, we also run operational assessment programs. So we have to deal with largely the same group of vendors. No offense, but the same group of vendors, which includes the KMBMs and the ETSs. Largely, that psychometric infrastructure is a unidimensional item response theory that had been set in stone for about, I would say, 40 years. And we're still dealing with remnants of that. Now, is it loosening up a little bit? Yes. So 10 years ago when, for example, I'm looking at Mark Hansen here, when he and I stepped into the room and we proposed to the States that you could actually develop your language proficiency assessment, the ALPA 21 assessment, as a MERT-based, multidimensional IRT-based assessment, the gasp was that, well, but we don't want to be first. There's nobody else out there doing consequential language proficiency tests, which has individual stakes involved, that would dare to use MERT. How do you know that the vendors will be able to carry this out? Well, here we are. We've been doing this. And the most recent one, the alternate assessment for English learners with the most significant cognitive disabilities, that's another example where we did some clever tricks and convinced people that you could do this. And lo and behold, we've done the field test. It's been in operation this year, and it's going to be able to provide kind of a nation's first of comparable language proficiency scale for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, where you have tons of domain exemptions. So how do you assign a score when 2 out of the 4 language domains are exempt? Now, it requires some creative modeling, but that can be done, and you could provide a very sound justification for why that is reasonable. So it's not like the tools are not there, but for companies that own these infrastructure, that's part of their existing sunken costs already. So it pays the companies to continue to use these infrastructure. But is it in the best interest of the learners that they purport to serve? That's a different question. There's something earlier that Ye mentioned, which is very, very important, and that is, I'm a statistician, and what I've been told from day one is that more information is better. More information identifies your parameters better. More information, however, is it prior information or based on literature or based on your empirical data, as long as there's a justifiable way for you to bring it in, it's going to improve your inference. You're going to make better decisions with more information. So, my only counterpoint often is that, well, if you really, really hate educational assessment or hate educational testing, then the question is, would you rather do with less information or with more information? And can people make more informed decisions with less information or more information? And the answer is probably, if you have the right tools, the right kind of assessments, you probably can make better informed decisions. Hence, these classroom-based assessment, that's an area where NCME, on the NCME board, and Tong was the former immediate outgoing president, and so was Randy. NCME cares very deeply about this, that this is an area where if you want to address disparities, if you want to see some change, it has to be in that area. And because it carries far less political risk compared to the Smarter Balanced, which Eva's here, it nearly killed us when we were, helping get it off the ground at the University of California. That thousands of hours of time. Anyway, that's for another day. But it's so political that any little thing that you fail to account for is just going to get magnified by the education press, by the public, and goes into spin machine. But in classroom assessments, these through-year assessments, these longitudinal pieces, not only would you have a real viable way of conditioning on prior achievement, prior differences, and recognize that people come in with different degrees of preparedness, and we need to get everybody to that same point. It's also far less constrained, and that allows you to experiment, and you must fail sometimes in order to make progress.
So the question is, where's the science, or where it should be? And notice how when we talk about, where's the science, or what is the scientific approach, we're thinking about the data analysis and the modeling. But theorizing is also part of doing science, actually a very important part. And I have talked with several colleagues about the concerns that we have about the fact that we know many people who learn sophisticated statistics, the latest statistical packages, very elegant names for the models that they are using, and they give you complicated outputs, and they can give you all the reasoning, the mathematical reasoning for what they did. But if you ask them, what is that representing in terms of the construct and the the cognitive model, they cannot tell you. They know the big data, they know how to use the big data, the machine learning, whatever, but they don't understand what a conceptual framework is. They don't know how those analyses and those data are operationalizations of a construct, and they don't care how those data were collected. Most of them use secondary data. They have not never developed an instrument. They are not used to reasoning about the cognitive processes involved in developing a test and taking a test. To me, that is a very concerning aspect, and that is the science that we should also have. So, in an ideal world, I have to say, by the way, that the same way that we have making the connection to fairness, the same way that we have many psychometricians who are very naive about cognition and culture and social equity, there are many people in the field of equity and social issues that are very naive about their expectations about measurement. So it goes both ways, right? It goes both ways. We have to say that clear and loud. So in an ideal world, I would like to have the schools of education that are forming measurement people have as mandatory courses that have to do with culture, with language, with cognition, because you can go through, you get your degree without taking any of those courses currently. And at the same time, those programs that focus on social issues, on culture, race, ethnicity, and so on, I would like for them to reason, for them to take mandatory courses that are more about reasoning about statistics, not the baby statistics 1 and baby statistics 2 that everybody is required to take, but so it's more about the reasoning and understanding how it works. Those are my ideals.
Yeah, with respect to the science, I think Willy's point about mutual naivete existing across fields is very important, because there is a lot of work going on in other fields that we could draw upon in educational measurement to help build this science, build the science we need in order to make assessment fairer. The learning sciences, there's a lot of work going on there. There's a lot of work going on in personalized learning that we could build upon, if we made more efforts to try and engage with those fields. And they could help us too in the course of becoming less naive on their part about, what it is we try to do. So I think that that's a productive direction to go in, trying to build up stronger multidisciplinary collaborations. Regarding formative assessment has the same problem that standardized assessment has. If you think about it, and Tyrone Howard essentially said this, he said 80% of teachers today are Caucasian and middle class. Well, those teachers bring to the classroom the perspectives, the lived experiences, the cultural identity, the interest and the background of people from that demographic. And they're dealing with a student population that is not white and middle class. It's majority students of color and majority students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. So there's a misalignment there. Those teachers are in general not going to be able to make strong connections for their students between the lived experiences those students bring and the expectations of the school. So how do we bridge that gap? As I said, it's the same problem with test developers because they're drawn from the same demographic. Test developers in K-12 are very often teachers or retired teachers, former teachers. So, this is all part of one similar problem, or it's part of the same problem. And part of the path toward solving that problem is trying to create a teaching force and a test developer force that is more aware of diverse cultures.
Okay, so we have 10 minutes left, and here's where the lack of a wireless microphone is actually going to pose a logistic question, but a logistic issue. But I want to open and spend these last 10 minutes opening for questions from the audience. We have lots of grad students and a few folks, professionals who are recognized who are working in this space. So let's hear from that side of the room now and ask our panelists about your pressing issues. But I'm going to have to ask you to walk to the microphone so we can have it for the video recording. I can repeat it too if you prefer. Yeah, Hayes. I'm sorry. We have a young student. She's my student.
And you were my student, and we can go through the whole list. Hi there. Is this on? Yes. I'm very interested in your discussion of personalization, which I don't think is on or off. You could, have degrees of it. And two things. One is the likelihood, in my mind, that you are encroaching on individual freedoms by getting more data from sensors or whatever. I mean, we probably are there already and it's too late. But on the other hand, it is a problem that I think we might want to think about. And then I'll push it to real extremes, because I think one of the things with assessment is that we start with the specifications and go forward. And somehow I think we should be going backwards from where we want people to be. Right, and then do the development that way, which may change your thoughts. So the example I will give you is, of course, from my own family. I have a grandson, Jacob, who is a data scientist for the Marlins. Just lost the wild card playoff opportunity. But I've been watching the number of variables they get on any individual. And what's very interesting is they're tied to interim and conclusive outcomes. They're not just, which way, how many balls does the guy take before he gets on base, or what his certain kinds of slugger percentages and things like that. They're measured against outcomes like, does he get on base? Does he advance? And up to what does the interaction with the team be? So you can involve other folks, not just the individual. And they have millions of lines of code, just for one game. I don't know how they're doing it. They have, lots of data analysts. So that model strikes me as potentially interesting, because you're not talking about scores, but if you go back to your computational models that we've been using forever, you're at the event level or behavioral level, way at the bottom before you start aggregating. And that I just wanted to ask you to think about what your reaction to that would be in the context of personalization. And as Randy and I have been with Ed Gordon the last 3 years, we're thinking about personalization with assessment and learning combined, not assessment over here, even as formative assessment, but, connected. So anyway, that's a question for you, or something to muse about. You can, say I'm completely out of it, which could be true.
I have a reaction to that. I think that's a very good question, and it essentially is telling us about the fact that as part of the psychometrics crisis, we need to refine our views of what a construct is, and the same way as Randy was telling you that learning to read as a blind person and in Braille and learning to read a printed text. I mean, we could claim that the reading construct is the same, but actually there's a huge interaction with the characteristics of the individual. So maybe we should start thinking about construct as an interaction of the postulated knowledge or domain and the characteristics of the individual. What is the level of granularity that we should have to do the customization? That is something that probably we obviously cannot answer right now, but probably would vary according to the content area and so many other things. But definitely, I think that is, we cannot just creating models, we keep creating models with existing psychometrics without revisiting the theories and coming up with something that is more comprehensive in terms of the social aspects of test taking, the cognitive aspects of test taking, and the psychometrics that is available for data analysis.
I have a quick comment. The idea of where the outcome is, and then go back to the very test design. Like if you think about licensure certification exam, right? That's how we actually develop the test blueprint. You do your job analysis, figure out what behavior, basically you have this 2-dimension thing. It's the frequency and importance of different tasks. And then you go from there for a specific profession, and then go from there to go back to what is important to test on your certification licensure exam. But Eva, what you talked about also got me thinking around, like, for with fairness in mind, with anti-racist in mind, as we think about our approaches to assessments, it doesn't really matter which type, K-12 admission, licensure. If we start off from where we want the outcome to be, and then continue to think through on the test development, I thought that's a really good idea. So thank you.
Something we haven't talked about yet with respect to machine-driven personalization is the issue of how that personalization is being done. What's the underlying model? In the event that it's a machine learning model, it becomes very important that the model be explainable if the consequences that are resulting from the use of the scores are going to be significant. So if it's for admission to selective higher education institution or licensure or what have you, we ought to be able to trace back to how that personalization was arrived at so that we can understand and defend to the examinee why it was that he or she was given the personalizations he or she was given. In the event that we're personalizing for the purpose of instruction or formative assessment, the demands for explainability, I think, are somewhat lower.
I think we're going to have time for maybe one more question. There's anything else that the audience... Yes, Ayis.
You can repeat and I have strong voice. I think that, I have so many things in my mind now. I could say that before thinking about personalizing the assessment, we should think about something that is in the context of K-12 more basic, which is opportunities to learn. I think that if we don't consider opportunity to learn what is actually happening in the classroom, we may be completely misinterpreting this course, independently of all the other things that we have to say about the test. I think that something that we are forgetting is crawling back a long time ago and making the distinction between test and assessment. And he was very clear saying, NAEP is the wrong name because we are not assessing, we are mainly testing. Assessment is focusing on different sources of information, making decisions not based on one score, but on other sources of information, and we are not doing that. So it always bothers me a little bit that we continue to use assessment and rather than just using testing. The other thing is, not a surprise that I agree with Willy, but actually it is a surprise in the field because I do believe that we're moving into actually what Derek Briggs mentioned in his presidential address at NBME last year. We need to start to make it clear what we mean by measuring and testing, and the fact that we have a lot of computational, and that's the word that he used, computational psychometricians, versus people who is doing measurement, really, but based on conceptualizing the construct, the meaning of the scores, that we are leaving also out. And finally, because I know...
Okay, one more.
No, and I just want to say, I think that something that the standards need to focus on, really honestly, is transparency. The technical reports are so lack of information about everything that fairness should be starting actually there. How many decisions were made, by who, when, under which conditions, what were the assumptions that were made. I mean, that in itself, I think that is something that we don't care that we should, because the public is not well informed. We don't know how things were made, and there are really very few companies in this country that are in charge of developing most of these state assessments. Very few. So, that was just
Okay, so I'll give our panelists a chance to address any one of Aita's three or four points. Not all of them, all of you, hopefully.
I agree.
You better.
Opportunity to learn is a central issue that pervades this whole discussion. It really is right at the heart of why fairness is such an important issue and why it poses such a problem. If you simply think about what tests do, tests conflate opportunity to learn with what you've been able to do with the opportunities you've been given. And we can't separate the two. And, that's the reason, from my perspective, why many institutions have dropped admissions testing. Because they've realized that it doesn't make sense to use a measure that so significantly reflects opportunity to learn to make decisions about whether to afford further opportunities to learn. That there's a circularity there that they just can't get around. And I think the presumption is that grades are less susceptible to those problems because teachers have a better sense of what it is they've taught. They know what opportunities they have given their students, and they factor that into their grades. And they have a sense of what backgrounds their kids come from, and they factor that into their grades. That's the presumption. So opportunities to learn, I think, are critically important in this whole discussion.
Can I make... Sorry. Go ahead. Absolutely. And going back to the conditioning argument that if there is a systematic way where one could conceivably, again, pardon my quantification tendencies, I'm a statistician, so I always think in terms of these mathematical simplifications, which can sometimes lead us astray, but it also helps in organizing our thoughts. That if you're able to assess, measure, define, however you choose to use the verb, but provide a variable that would allow the test scores be conditioned upon, then that's explicit conditioning. It, in fact, within California, it's not illegal. Because if you put, say, nationality, gender, these things into that equation, it's illegal because of Prop 209. But if you don't, you use something else, which is the genius of the eligibility in a local context. The percent plan is that where you come from in terms of your high school, that actually represents a large portion of the background, the information that we're trying to get at, the opportunities, the resources, the neighborhood, right? But then going to your other questions about the reasons institutions drop the SAT, there may be various reasons, and I have been very bruised by that battle, that I'm afraid that, Randy, that institutions have their own reasons. And the funny thing is that, in fact, the high school GPA is, in fact, worse, far worse in terms of inequities. That we know, we have data that I got from the UC that suggests that, in fact, in California, there is a lot of difference in high school grading standards. And guess what? I could just say that probably it's the kind of schools that you do not really want to favor if you get to make all the decisions, that are getting these very high average GPAs that actually are not so predictive of students' performance, actual performance within the University of California. And on the other hand, what about the other factors? Extracurriculars, the essays. Oh God, that's even worse. That is even worse than the SAT, as the Stanford study has recently shown. And that finding is quite robust and very consistent with the UC-based data that I have at least seen in my brief period serving on boards. So we're in this conundrum where now we have ChatGPT, where it can write those essays, and people can afford $25,000 coaching sessions for counselors that they'll just do well left and right. So that's why early on I said, let's forget about these elite institutions, this one included. Because for a public university to have admissions rate around 8 or 9%, I really don't know what to do about it. It shouldn't be like that. And the elite institutions, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, they're just going to be there. They'll be fine. It's this middle tier that, in fact, train the most of our future engineers, scientists, doctors. We have to care about these people. We have to do something. And the assessment systems have to respond to that.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Lee. So I sadly need to call this session to an end. I want to thank our panelists very much. This was a terrific experience. I want to encourage you to, for those of us who were here in this room, I know I'm going to want to be looking at the video from the other breakout, because something I was discussing with someone before this breakout is that if ETS and Pearson and all of the vendors stopped producing tests today in a bout of never before seen multi-billion-dollar companies refusing business, right? If they were to do that today, by next month there would be new vendors who would be providing the assessments, because the part of the problem that we're kind of leaving aside here for obvious reasons, but we have to, but the part of the problem that we're not talking about is that this is very market-driven. The public and the legislatures are demanding these tests that need to be produced in a few months, and then are going to be used for multiple purposes, none of which, or maybe one of which, has been validated well enough. And so there's that part of the policy discussion, or these measurement discussion in a way is subject to then mandates, that to the extent that there are mandates, the standards aren't mandates, there are suggestions, there are shoulds. And we could say that the standards are going to be musts, but whether they're actually going to be legal musts is going to be determined in that room, not in this room, right? In some ways, in some important ways. And so those conversations are inseparable, intractable in some ways. And so I encourage all of us to go watch the video from the other room and then engage in conversations with the folks that were there, because that's what needs to happen, I think, for this to move forward. So again, thank you so very much. Thank our panelists. Let's give it a round of applause, and we'll see you soon.